Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Sitecore User Group India. Today is the last day of this week, and we thought to share some knowledge with you. So, today we have Rob with us. He is Technology Director at IO, one of the leading digital agencies in the Netherlands, and he has 16 plus years of experience on Sitecore platform with various technologies and projects. And he is at Sitecore MVP, and he has been awarded this title 8 times in a row, which is a big achievement in Sitecore community. And today's topic is migrating your Sitecore DXP to XM Cloud. So XM Cloud is new buzz right now in the Sitecore world. So this is related to how you can migrate your current DX platform to the XM Cloud, and what are the learnings and challenges that would be shared by the Rob. So I hope you will get to learn something through this session. And meanwhile, if you have any questions, you can post it in the chat window, and we will answer your questions at the end of the session. So thank you for the joining, and over to you, Rob.
Thanks. Thank you for the great introduction. You've covered the topic, so let's start right away. Today, we are going to look at the bigger picture when it comes to migrating your Sitecore DXP to XM Cloud. We are going to look at what the differences are and how you approach a typical migration scenario. And also in that regard, what topics deserve your attention when it comes to, well, old habits like customizing content results, for example. And afterwards, we have some time for Q&A. If you have any questions, if you're looking to the recorded version in the webinar then just contact me via my social channels. I will share them in one of the last slides with you. My name is Rob Habrake. I'm a technology director in Sitecore MVP at IO. And I have over 15 years of experience in Sitecore development. And for me, XM Cloud is a whole new exciting chapter. So let's first have a look at the major differences in setup, architecture, and mindset. What makes XM Cloud different from Platform DXP? In a way, it's comparing apples to apples, but there are some important differences. So what I've done here, first, let's look at the overall differences between the two. What makes XM Cloud different? If you compare it to XP or to the Platform DXP, as we now call the product we all know from Sitecore. XM is a lighter version because it only is XM Cloud is only an XM instance, but I've named it a powerhouse XM because it does more than only XM. It has some embedded personalization and some native analytics included, and it also has an improved editing experience. So opposed to the experience editor, we now have the ability to edit pages with Sitecore pages, as it's called. So for content editors, things are changing, but also from a development perspective. We kind of have the benefits of SaaS combined with the flexibility of PaaS, and also the way we interact with it, because it's, presented as SaaS software. You actually change the way you develop onto it, rather next to it than on top of it. And what that means is something I'm going to cover in the next section. Very important, it's part of a composable DXP. So composability means that integration is very important. And that means that XM Cloud as a product does not stand alone. It's part of a larger offering of multiple products. We're not going to cover them but I'm going to refer to some because in doing so, in moving from the more monolithic all-in-one solution Sitecore once was towards the composable setup, some functionality has been moved from XP to other composable products of Sitecore. So that's important to know. And as I said, we have a whole new development experience, and that means that not only editing is improved, but also the way we develop with it. Some things are going faster, smoother, and I think are better suited towards a modern way of implementing and developing content management. So let's first of all look at the architecture of XM Cloud, and I'm not going to deep dive into this, but I want to share some concepts with you for the basic understanding in this talk. The first thing that strikes you when you look at XM Cloud is that the topology is way less complex. You have fewer roles, and you don't have to configure them on yourself. We've had role-based configurations for a while, so it already was a little bit less configuration than we're used to in the past, but still you had a lot of roles in Sitecore XP. And now if you look at XM Cloud, it basically all boils down to only the CM role, the content management role. On the left side, I have depicted the development environment, and on the right side, the XM Cloud. You both populate them content-wise, code-wise from your repository, and you can deploy to either environment. The development environment is provided to you by Sitecore. It's prepared by Sitecore, so you can fork or copy a code repository and start working on it, and you get the containers, you get the setup, all good to go right away with a running Sitecore instance locally. You have your content editor and your experience editor as you used to, and the supporting roles like Solr and SQL are all there, but you don't really have to look at those. And on the right side, you see XM Cloud, which also contains a content management instance, the CM instance, and also an Edge. And Edge is actually an API to query against using GraphQL. And it also provides a CDN for your Sitecore media library. Then you have a rendering host, and the rendering host contains all the front-end files, like in the case of Next.js, your TypeScript files, for example. And they're not so much used to publish the website, but they're used for editing purposes. And that's why the rendering host is also often called the editing host. I will refer to that with that term in my talk a few more times later on. So the rendering host or editing host is used for Sitecore pages and for the experience editor for editing and for preview purposes. That's the reason why you also need to push your front end to XM Cloud. Apart from the fact that the real front-end application that's being used in production, for example, and on your acceptance and test environment, of course, when you're visiting the website, is a self-provided front-end, and you can pick the technology you like. And Next.js is the one that we prefer to use, and that's also the one you most often see in all the examples given around. You have in the XM Cloud environment, you have a core and a master database, no web database anymore. And obviously your good old content editor. And this is all provisioned by Sitecore. So you can deploy to it, but once you have access to the environment, this is all already in place. So, as I said, there's no web database anymore in XM Cloud, and that also changes the way publishing works. In the past, publishing was a copy action from the master to the web database, and your content resolving would happen like at request time. And obviously, you could configure multiple publishing targets, so web only being the default publishing target, but that was how it was set up by default. XM Cloud does not have a web database, and the publishing is actually creating a snapshot of your layout data and storing it on the CDN. So you can imagine that it is very fast. Also, when you have personalization configured, you will get multiple snapshots with multiple variants of your content, and they all live on the edge as static data. And this also means a lot for what you can do when implementing Sitecore. I will get to what that means, but first let's compare the architectures. And I mean the architectures of your Sitecore implementation, because as I said, it kind of changes the way how we work with the system, how we work with Sitecore. When you look at a typical Sitecore implementation, and I should immediately say I think it's appropriate to mention a small disclaimer. This is not something that was the default or had to be done like this. You could do it in any other way as well, or what I'm going to show you in a bit on how I would go forward with the working with XM Cloud. But this is what I typically see. So your mileage may vary. But well, we, for example, are working with a lot of more complex websites that do not only contain the static CMS data, but also have some functionality like e-commerce sites showing products. So we need some catalog data in there, but maybe also a booking engine that we connect with to do bookings or check availability. And we most often for web portals and stuff also connect with an external identity provider. So what we've did in the past is we've actually layered the implementation of all those connectivity on top of Sitecore. So you get your Sitecore implementation, you install it locally, and you start to add projects in your Visual Studio solution and develop your data integrations there. Obviously, when using Helix, it was all nicely vertically separated in your architecture, but still it wasn't the same solution, which also includes the business logic. And when we're publishing data to, for example, React GSS app, it was a merge of both static and dynamic data. This is easy for the front end, so they don't really have to worry about anything where the data comes from, and it's generating a certain abstraction towards the front end. But it also means that we're heavily tied in with the Sitecore implementation. So your development domain, as I depicted with the blue line, the blue dotted line, is that actually your development domain includes Sitecore as an implementation. And on top of that, we've created a habit of customizing everything. If we needed to change something in pipelines, content resolvers, or render pipelines, we actually did that. So that creates a high dependency, which is difficult to maintain, but also, for example, makes upgrading a little bit more difficult. If you look at XM Cloud, and this is the way I drew the new way of working, the new architecture, it kind of forces you to work with the better separation of concern in your architecture, and it actually pushes away all the custom implementation, business logic, connectivity outside of the Sitecore implementation. So you can still deploy to Sitecore for all the really Sitecore related stuff, but your actual development domain of your site implementation lives outside of the Sitecore domain. And it also means a shift in ownership, because you are now working solely on your own implementation of your own front end and your own back end, and your CI/CD pipelines are going to be more separated. more efficient, and it's going to be also in the mindset of composability and using Mach as a principle. It's going to be easier to maintain, higher maintainability. So what we would do is we would move all the integrations and the functionality, push them towards the head, so, or the front end, if you like to call it. So you have your Next.js app, and your URL resolves to a layout, which will be retrieved via from the edge as the snapshot I just described. And you can, if you want, query for additional content using Graph. I will also show you an example of that if you need to populate any lists or anything on the front end that does rely on the data in Sitecore. But the integrations with third-party stuff like the booking engine and the catalog data, as I previously described, would move ideally to a microservice that you build. So you actually isolate your integration and your business logic, considering that integration, into a microservice, and you need to call the microservice from your front end directly, which also makes your front end a little bit more complex and heavy, but your total architecture will be will actually improve. And another example I can give is, for example, that also things like security implementations also move towards the front end, because you don't any longer have a content delivery role inside Core. You don't have a web database. You can't access the user rights or permissions within your content model. So you're only working with statically published data, which is making it far quicker, but also moves the touch point of your integrations. So due to this difference in architecture, and also XM being a subset of XP in terms of functionality, not everything in your current solution is going to be compatible or can be persisted from your current platform. So let's have a look at what is supported in XM Cloud, because that is a good indication of what your migration path is going to look like. And it also plays an important role in assessing how compatible your current setup actually is when migrating to XM Cloud. I've split up the differences in a more functional part, which is this, and a more technical part. Functionality-wise, everything that's related to XConnect, XDB, or your marketing applications is going to move, or you have to move that towards an implementation based on either Sitecore Personalize, Sitecore CDP, or a combination of those two. So things like your experience profile, marketing automation, path analyzer, that's all not going to be available anymore. And also the way it is implemented in Personalize and CDP is completely different. So you need to re-architect, redesign those implementations. Though personalization rules are supported, because the basic functionality of Sitecore Personalize is also embedded within XM Cloud by default. So only using the XM Cloud license, you still have some basic personalization rules and possibilities. Again, you need to re-architect them, reconfigure, because the mechanism is working different from what you used to. But it's cool that you can now start with that, and the functionality within XM Cloud and the separate Sitecore Personalized product is actually exactly the same. So if you want to upgrade or add Sitecore Personalized as a composable part onto your on top of your architecture, and you already have an XM Cloud implementation, you don't have to change anything. You can just start using the new features. The email experience manager is no longer available, and you could use Sitecore Send for that, or an equally or an equal product to Sitecore Send if you like. because, well, composability also means flexibility to point vendors, and you could integrate any email provider there, but for within the Sitecore proposition and product range, Sitecore Send is now the product to go to. Sitecore Forms, currently that's not supported in Action Cloud. So if you want something, some kind of a form management tool, you can only use a third-party product over here. Though I've heard that Sitecore is working on this, and probably in the course of, like, I don't know, this year or maybe within a year, we might see a release that allows to use some kind of form implementation. But as it stands, you have to find another solution for that. And Sitecore Identity was replaced by Sitecore Unified Identity. That's not for site or front-end login, but we did use Sitecore Identity for that in the past, but you cannot longer do that. It's merely to identify users between the different composable products within the Sitecore management on the Sitecore portal. From a more technical perspective, the changes are, well, most of them are quite obvious. So in general, MVC is not supported at this moment on Action Cloud. And you have to go with JSS. But also anything that is more like front-end related, the content delivery role, is not supported because it's fully headless. So things like IP geolocation, universal tracker, device detection, that's not something you want to embed into Action Cloud because you only have the CM role and you publish your content statically, and the head is living outside of Action Cloud. So that means that you have to transfer everything to a headless implementation with ESS. You can use SXA for that, but for example, the SXA search components are not available anymore because anything search related or anything with the custom search indexes is no longer possible. There's a Solr instance included in your container setup if you install it, but it's only used for the basic needs of Sitecore itself. And so if you want to do a custom search, which is more of a crawling type of search, you should use Sitecore Search for that. And if you want to do content queries, to a certain extent, you can use GraphQL for that, which I will cover later on. Anything that's going to be related to tracking analytical data is replaced by Sitecore CDP. And the other things like the Sitecore Publishing Service and the Update Center are no longer needed because, well, the publishing changed that I showed you. So the conventional publishing service doesn't longer apply, and the update center isn't actually necessary at all, which is very good news because Sitecore will keep your instance up to date. So every time you deploy, you will get the latest version of the containers, and that also goes for locally. So if you're starting up your containers, you will see updates coming in automatically because Sitecore maintains the container registry for your local environment as well. So that's great news. So to summarize, I've created this kind of compatibility comparison chart, and this shows you that anything that's considering basic personalization or analytics is built in Action Cloud. So you're good. If that's what you're using from XP, you can use Action Cloud as well for that. If you have requirements for a more advanced personalization or marketing automation, you want to redesign your implementation based on personalized and CDP. So you're first going to maybe replace it and scrap the functionality that you have in a migration part, that I will show you how to approach it as well. Search functionality is replaced by Sitecore Search. EXM by Sitecore Send, and obviously MVC needs to be migrated to JSS. And all the other things like publishing, deploying, and updating will be taken care of by Action Cloud. So that's no longer any of your own concern as a developer, and I think that's great news. So all these changes, all these differences in what the product proposition is kind of dictates what your migration part is going to look like. If you utilize a lot of XP functionality, you need to carve them out first. And from a composable point of view, that's perfectly possible on your current implementation. So before starting the actual migration. So how would you go about migrating, and when does it make sense to migrate? Let's have a look at a typical migration project roadmap. Again, disclaimer, every scenario is different. Our implementations vary immensely. So this is only a rough idea on how I would approach it and which steps you need to take. The first one is assessment, doing your gap analysis on what the differences are, and find your own customizations in your implementations that you have made on Sitecore. You need to be aware of what's going on in your implementation and start planning. The second phase is the preparation phase, where you start transforming your architecture on your current setup. So I wouldn't immediately start with migrating and then changing things. I would start introducing composable principles in your current implementation. Then you start reworking the front end. Depends on what framework you're using right now. Obviously, MVC is going to be a bigger gap. If you already utilized GSS, or even as it say with JSS, then you're going to be way faster in doing this. But also your content distribution will probably change, because you can no longer utilize all of the things you have done before with the content resolvers. And the last step would be the actual migration, where you set up your new implementation based on Action Cloud and carry out the actual migration itself. So you, in this model, you first prepare everything before you migrate. And that means that the complexity, the impact, and the workload over time actually lies more in the preparation phase, and depending on your situation in the rework. And this is an imaginary line of where I think the most effort goes to. So if we deep dive in these steps of the roadmap, let's look at what those steps mean and what you're actually going to do. Are going to do. So first, you start taking inventory. You need to know what customizations do you have. Not only the content resolvers and the render pipelines, but also things like maybe custom Sitecore editing fields in your editing environment, because, well, as you know, we now have Sitecore pages, and while most of the custom fields and custom editing UIs will work in the content editor and in the experience editor that are still available, Sitecore pages is mostly not relying on your implementation. It's a separate, and it's a real SaaS product. So it doesn't live on your implementation fully on your Action Cloud instance. So that means that not everything is going to be possible. So you need to be aware of all the customizations you have. And secondly, the integrations, examples like the booking engine, the catalog data, what are you integrating with, and how are they embedded into your architecture? Make a list of your personalization rules, because you need to reapply them, and that's going to be mostly manual labor by a marketer. And then you can do the gap analysis. Which Sitecore version are you on? What upgrade path are you looking at? How much do you leverage the actual XP functionality, or non-XM in that case? And do you need to utilize other composable products to get the same functionality back in your new landscape? And obviously, if you're already using a JSS or not. And then you can start planning your migration path to actually isolate and refactor components in preparation to the migration. And this preparation actually means that you are going to maybe carve out functionality from your current implementation and let them live alongside your implementation. So I have two examples. First of all, if you have such a booking engine that has an integration that's built into your Sitecore implementation, you might want to move those to a microservice using a booking engine integration and moving the touch point with that integration to the front end. So you're actually making your Sitecore implementation smaller and already starting to leverage the composable architecture principles. But also maybe you could change out functionality in your current implementation for new composable functionality. Sitecore Search is a good example of that. Sitecore Search is a SaaS product that has a front-end integration. And if you're currently having or using custom Sitecore indexes, a custom Solr implementation and stuff, you can just integrate Sitecore Search on your current Platform DXP, XP Sitecore implementation. And when that all is functional and it works properly, then you can just remove the Solr stuff, the custom indexes. And what you're doing is you're making your Sitecore implementation more mean and lean, smaller, which also means that if you, after doing those steps, migrate to 10.3, your upgrade path is going to be quicker, easier, less customizations, less code to maintain, to upgrade. And then you can move towards reworking the front end. You need to drop your custom rendering pipelines if you still have them, because, well, you're moving towards a headless architecture. For your custom content resources, you need to kind of determine the purpose on why you have them and maybe rethink or redesign them. I have a topic on that at the end of this presentation. So the asterisk is because you might be able to keep them, but in all cases, and I will explain what that means in a bit. And then, depending on your Delta, develop new renderings or rework them to any of the headless SDK options that you have, so that being either JSS or the ASP.NET implementation, as long as it's utilizing the Sitecore layout service client. And lastly, if you want to keep your renderings, that's perfectly possible. If you're using SXA or your own Helix structure, if you're already utilizing a headless setup, this should be rather effortless because it should still work exactly the same. The architecture of that part isn't really changed going to XMCloud. And when you've done all that, which I reckon is the most of the migration path, then you can set up a new solution based on XMCloud Foundation Head. Start updating your NuGet feed to Sitecore XMCloud because you need to change out your dependencies and start configuring your XMCloud build JSON for things like item serialization, which projects you need to build in your solution, because they also need to be built on the Sitecore XMCloud instance after deployment. Configuring things like editing hosts and doing any configuration transforms that you require. Because this is not a how-to on XMCloud, I don't really dive too deep in this. It's just to show you some of the steps you need to take. Because I'm focusing more on the actual migration path here. Then you can configure your Sitecore content serialization modules if you're already utilizing that, that's awesome, because that makes your content migration way easier. And you might also want to look at maybe the authoring API, so you can automate some of your content migration if you're coming from other sources. That's going to be like a custom tailor-made solution. But if you just serialize everything from your current implementation, you could perfectly well push that using SCS to your new Axiom Cloud instance. So you'll set up rather quickly. And when everything is up and running, you can start reapplying the personalization rules based on a new design. And maybe you want to look into your CI/CD pipelines, because they are going to change as well, obviously. Sitecore deployment to Axiom Cloud is going to be a few CLI commands, so that is very easily embedded in a CI/CD pipeline. But you also want to deploy your front end, and you want to embed your content serialization in your CI/CD pipeline as well. I may, at some point in time, do a separate talk about this topic alone, because I also think it's quite interesting to see how that evolves in a composable architecture. So, as I said, your development experience is changing. It's going to be easier because you don't have to set up Sitecore yourself. I think onboarding is way easier because of the containers. You do have less configuration to make, and your deployments are going to be faster. Deploying to Sitecore Axiom Cloud is only a matter of minutes. But in most of the cases, if you have such a more composable architecture, if you work with microservices and stuff, and a separate front end, you will probably also have smaller deployments, because you're only at one point in time deploying to one of the targets and not your whole application every time you need to change something. But there's, as always, a little bit of a challenge to get the front-end and back-end developers working together efficiently in a proper workflow. I'm still figuring out what works best for us as well. But there's a few things you should know. There's two modes you can use to work locally. The first one is fully local, which is the one I mentioned earlier, where you are going to pull all the containers in, run them on your local environment, which requires a Windows machine. So it's mostly targeted at backend developers, this workflow. And then you can just change your renderings on this. They will automatically be updated in your Sitecore containers. You can use Sitecore content serialization to push items into your container, and you can also deploy to it if you have custom code. So that's awesome, because you have a whole representative environment running locally on containers. And you can't really test your work on Sitecore pages. And for that, you need to deploy to Axiom Cloud, to your Axiom Cloud instance. So one of the environments that you have in Axiom Cloud, you basically at least get 3 environments, 2 non-production and 1 production. One of the non-production environments could be a development environment where you can deploy to test your Sitecore pages. Compatibility of your renderings and editing experience. But as I said, this requires a Windows machine. So for people that do not want to run the containers locally or are not able to, you can also now work in Edge mode. And Edge mode is going to, well, if you have, for example, a Next.js dev server running locally as a front-end developer, maybe, you can actually query content straight from the edge of your Axiom Cloud instance, as I said, selecting your development environment on Axiom Cloud. And that's awesome because it's going to be easy to change content on the CM instance, maybe create new templates. You need to sync them back to the local development, your repository. So that's going to be a question mark within your workflow design between your developers, but you can change things on the CM instance in Axiom Cloud and then query content using Still, if you're changing renderings locally and testing against Edge, you can't actually use Pages, or you need to configure it to use your local environment. And there's some work involved in that. So you can also just, well, publish or deploy your renderings to XMCloud and then test it over there. And so if you merge those two ways of working, you would first do some Sitecore, which is mostly backend related work, but not per se. Things like creating templates, rendering items, and some test content, or templates, which is also content, obviously. Commit that to Git, and then deploy your code, serialize all the content, and then your front-end developer can start working Edge mode, connecting to the XMCloud instance, working on its Next.js renderings, and committing that change, deploying it again, and then it can be tested on your XMCloud instance. I think this is a rather proper workflow, but you need to deploy 2 times. If you work more directly on the development environment, you can maybe omit this. But I'm still working out what works best, and we're only just a few months in our project. So I think we will see some development and some ideas maybe shared within the community on this. One last topic, and I think I'm maybe running a little bit late, but not too much. So I do have some time left for the last topic, which is moving away from custom content resolvers towards utilizing GraphQL. So I've seen the question, can you still use custom content resolvers on XMCloud? And first people thought this wasn't possible, but actually the answer is yes, you can do so. But there's a change in how content is resolved. I showed you this earlier, where the platform DXP publishes to a web database and resolving the content at request time. The XMCloud setup actually publishes to the Edge, storing a static snapshot of your layout and your data on the Edge. So that means the actual process of resolving content happens at a different point in time. So that also means that any custom content resolvers that you have also move to publishing time. And that's changing a few things and what you can and what you can't do. For one, it's, your content resolvers will not be impacted by cache invalidation. You can't do dynamic stuff. Dynamic data retrieval at request time, depending on context, user, that kind of stuff, that's not something you can do because the content is statically stored on the Edge. So your content resolver is not the point to hook into if you want to do dynamic things. So should you still use them? Well, it kind of depends, obviously. And you have 2 options. You can transfer your custom content resolver because they still work, but only if they are producing static data. So functionally, the mechanism still works, but the data is stored statically. So, well, that's the only option you have if you want to persist using them. And the other option, instead of using a custom content resolver, is actually restructuring your actual content. So you are able to use the out-of-the-box content resolvers. And there's a number of them. You probably know them. You have the data source and the context item resolvers, both have a children resolver, so you can go over all the children of an item, either that being the data source or the context. And you can use the folder filter resolver to go through the sentence and do things like excluding folders. So an example could be that if you, for example, have a footer item And in a separate part of your content tree, you have a list of social links, and you would write a custom content resolver to collect those social links and embed them in the output when requesting the footer data. That still works because it's producing static data. But you can also decide to, and that's B, option B over here, you can also decide to actually move the social link items within Sitecore underneath the footer item. And in a lot of cases, that's actually maybe a bit more clean because you can drop a lot of code. If you use out-of-the-box content resolvers, you have less functionality, less code to both test and maintain, so less possibility of introducing bugs and creating a lot of code you have to maintain for doing kind of basic stuff. So if you don't reuse content in a lot of places, you might be better off putting it in the exact spot where you want it to go and don't use a custom content resolver. So then the question arises, why did we even use custom content resolvers? Well, first of all, initially, Sitecore advertised this in its documentation as a way of customizing your data model. So a lot of people started actually utilizing that. And I've seen projects creating kind of default behavior of always creating a custom content resolver, because we can do things like changing field names to comply with the front-end structure, simplifying the data model, restructuring content, like, as I said, for the footer, combining items, changing over the hierarchy, all to make the output to the front end a little bit more clear. But it's introducing a lot of C# code into your projects that you also need to maintain. And I've also seen things like including dynamic data. I have a few examples of that in a minute. Or things like performing additional operations, hooking into the content resolvers. And if you look at what you can do and what you can't do, it's quite simple. Everything, including dynamic data or performing additional operations, is impossible in Accent Cloud. All the other things are perfectly possible, but you might be better off utilizing GraphQL or even restructuring your actual content items. So I went through a number of projects, and I have a little bit of pseudocode in my presentation to show you what I've encountered going over the custom content resolvers. I don't want to share this code to explain to you what happens, to just show it as an example. This is a nice one. This is showing custom facet data, which is XDB related. So this whole logic has to go anyway because Accent Cloud doesn't support XDB. But it's funny what happens because this is a category page that's actually a virtual or a dynamic wildcard page. And we wanted to track visitors or count page visits. And we used the content resolver to actually automatically count the visit, which is, from a developer point of view, awesome, because automatically when the page is being visited, the counter is increased. Awesome, right? Doesn't work because now this will be never called, only once at publish time. So you need to split this off and make maybe a separate microservice to do some kind of logic like this, or maybe move it completely to another place in your architecture and trigger it from the front end. So then we're back to a basic custom, a basic content resolver, and we can drop the custom stuff. And this one is also a nice one because it's also dynamic. It's changing the URL and the text on a button based on a query string parameter. It's not going to work in Accent Cloud because it's dynamic, so it will not change. The publish doesn't have a query string parameter, So it will always be empty. So you actually need to move this kind of logic towards the head. And it even makes more sense over there as well, because, well, the query string parameter is coming from the front end. So why do you want to put all this logic and maintain all those code lines in your backend anyway? So you need to drop this and implement it in your front end. This is a nice example because it's coming directly from the Sitecore documentation files. And what you can see here is it's producing static content in a way, so this would work in XM Cloud, but the outcome is probably not what you expect it to be, because there's a date attribute set to datetime.now, which in XP would be the request date time, but in XM Cloud, this would be the published date. So that's a nice one to illustrate what the change in process is, content resolving. And the last one is building up breadcrumbs. And there's a whole lot of code behind this. This is only the initial caller of the breadcrumb type resolver that we've built. And it actually builds up a breadcrumb going through the navigable pages in your Sitecore tree and concatenating them into a breadcrumb. This would actually work because it produces static content, and only each time a content item actually changes, it needs to be published. So this would be updated, so it works. But you can drop a whole lot of code and all the code behind this for the breadcrumb type resolver if you use GraphQL for this. So this example, I think it's also coming from the documentation, is a breadcrumb filled GraphQL query, which is going to do, well, it's going to browse through all the navigable pages, because you can select has layout is true. It's going to show you all the navigable pages, and you can filter on a specific data template if you like. So as you can see, this is going to be way less code and easier to maintain and more agile than building C# code for this. So this is my point in that you might want to consider moving your content resolvers to more optimized GraphQL queries. And you can do a lot of other things in GraphQL as well. You can do things like filtering on, for example, a category, or you can do a search on certain field values, like all the news items with the term cloud in the title, for example. It obviously does have its limitations. For those who already know GraphQL, you probably know that you can't do recursive queries. And if it's going to be more complex search implementations, you better use Sitecore Search for that. But for the basic needs of retrieving lists and data, this is going to be the more clean way, opposed to building custom content resolvers. So it's time for a conclusion. What have we learned? Well, first, I think it's best to start with moving out your customizations first and start building up a composable architecture on your current setup. Isolate all the integrations and other business logic into microservices and push the touch points to the front end. Depending on your implementation, you probably are going to need to revision your content structure and the way you resolve your content. And if you're not already using JSS, you need to migrate to a headless approach as well. If the delta is way too big, then it might be better to just start with working on a new XM Cloud project, maybe reusing some code here and there or some renderings here and there, and building up a new solution in a more hybrid or parallel approach. Maybe a reverse proxy to run two implementations at the same time, and swapping the visitor between the environments based on the page that that he is requesting. That's also a scenario, obviously, but if you really want to migrate your current setup, I think those 4 steps are going to help you in a clean approach on it. So, and the benefits to actually do this and go through the whole route of migration is that you would end up with a better overall architecture, one that is more future-proof. You have a higher level of separation, and the future integrations are going to be easier. You have a more composable setup, and your development domain is smaller and more mean and lean. So you are more in control, and maybe the most important one, you have less maintenance and no upgrades for Sitecore anymore. And that all means that you can create more business value. Thanks for your attention. If you want to reach out to me, you can go to Slack or Twitter. I'm still on there, not really all that active anymore, but you can reach me. I prefer Slack though. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out or share your experiences. Thanks for your attention. And if you have any questions right now, then please let me know.
So I don't see any question in chat window, but if you have any question, please, you can raise your hand. So I can allow you to unmute and then you can discuss with her. Otherwise, you can reach out to us if you have any questions in the future. That is also fine.
I see one remark about connecting your XM to pages. It is true that it is documented, and I've seen multiple people experimenting with it, but I also got some mixed feedback on how it works, how smooth it actually works. And because I did not experiment with it myself, I actually didn't give any advice on it in this presentation, but sure, check out the link that Michelangelo shared with everyone, because that's actually the thing you want to go to if you want to experiment with it. Yeah, that's a good question. Can you migrate 10.1 to XM, or do you first need to, because I think that's what you're meaning is that, do you need to upgrade to 10.3 first, or can you move right away? Well, honestly, I think the official answer would be upgrade to 10.3, but considering you're kind of redoing a whole lot of stuff, I think it's mostly going to be compatible, but it really depends on your solution. If you have some integrations or some customizations, you probably need to upgrade to 10.3. If it's a very basic site with only some default templates and content and headless renderings, I reckon it might work just coming from 10.1, but I didn't try. The solutions we are migrating are either on 10.3 or we are using the hybrid approach.
Thank you, Rob, for the amazing presentation. I'm finding it's newer and newer for myself. It's the next time. So typically, a couple of questions. The first one related to Edge. What is literally happening when we are publishing? So we are saying that we are creating like a snapshot, returning back to the old approach. Obviously, we are moving data from one DB to another, but in regards of Edge, is it? I saw that in configuration file, the provider is using like a file system for that. So do you know what is happening behind the scene?
No, I do not. I only know that what it does, it stores a snapshot of both your content and your layout at that time. And if you have personalization configured, there's also a limit on the variations you can create. I think up to 8 per page. Then it just stores 8 different versions of your 8 different snapshots of your content combined with your layout. but I'm actually unaware of the underlying architecture on how it's implemented.
Okay, thank you very much. And the next question is related to deployment. So when we are talking about XM Cloud deployment, not the head one, but XM Cloud. So does it mean that during the time our server is reloaded? So obviously we understand when we're deploying C# code, there load some kind of happening, but we don't want this to be done, for example, if we just deploy some changes or hot fixes to our head. So
as far as my knowledge goes right now, and because things are continuously updated, this might already be outdated at this very moment in time, but maybe also when you're watching back the webinar. As far as I know, currently you cannot separate deploying to the rendering engine host, to the rendering host, and or deploying to Sitecore with some build code. So right now you have to deploy everything, which is, by the way, typically only taking up like 5 minutes or so. But I've heard that they're working on creating a separate option to only deploy your renderings, which would be awesome, because that would be even faster indeed. So it's a good point you're giving. That would streamline the process immensely. Also in terms of the workflow, because as a front-end developer, you can then only deploy your front-end changes, which is going to be way quicker. By the way, how it works underneath, they're using Kubernetes and containers, so it's not causing any downtime. Obviously, the edge is still persisting in snapshots, and I didn't notice any interruption on the CM role when editing content myself during a deployment.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thanks for the questions. I think there's no more questions. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
So I think we that is one. It acts like
I'm exactly. I'm not sure if it's called blue-green in Kubernetes. I think it's rolling updates, so it's probably rolling out a new pod, and then swapping pods once the deployment is finished. So that is indeed like blue-green that we're used to setting up ourselves sometimes. Yeah, okay, thanks.
Yes, that is what my understanding is. So okay. I think I don't have any questions. So it was a great session, and it was great insights to us. So we definitely can take this forward for further understanding of the XM Cloud and the concepts. And thank you for sharing your learnings with us. And thank you all for joining. I will shortly share the recording of this session.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me, and for the opportunity of sharing. And well, have a nice weekend.
Thank you. Have a nice weekend.
Bye-bye.
Bye.